I see some familiar faces. Can you hear me in the back? Good. One correction to the introduction. It's 330 million gods and goddesses. Million. Give or take. We have 1 hour. Let's hit it. 330 million gods and goddesses. Polytheism, as in more than one godism? Well, it depends on who you talk to. There are Hindus who argue that their religion is actually monotheistic. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about today. Where do we even begin? I mean, it took a long time to develop that many faces for the divine, right? And that's what we've been talking about so far, right? How is it that we picture the divine? What does he look like? Or she? Or in this instance, they? Or perhaps even it look like? How is it that we imagine God to be? What metaphors, and at some level they are all metaphors, what metaphors do we use? Or to put it another way, how have we constructed the divine in our minds, and not just our individual minds, but our social minds, right? To try to understand what is, at the end of the day, perhaps beyond understanding. And I think the religious tradition of Hinduism gives us an excellent opportunity to think about that. So, welcome to the adventure, and let's see what we can figure out. This is so complex. What you can do is, as with any religious tradition, trace the evolution of thinking as time goes on. And with Hinduism, we have plenty of time to work with because, well, for one thing, maybe I should back up. The first thing we need to realize is that there really is no such thing as Hinduism. Okay? That is a name, that is a blanket, if you will, that we toss over an incredibly complex cultural phenomenon, a mixture, if you will, of beliefs and practices and myths. And you know what myth means, right, from the week before last. Not fairy tales, but religious stories. And the word Hinduism doesn't even come from the Indians. Who named this religion Hinduism? Well, who owned India until the middle of the 20th century, right? The British. Yes. And they themselves were struggling to understand what was going on. Religious studies scholars have wrestled with it. My dear colleague, Dr. Amy Alako, is an expert in Hinduism. Her work is mainly in South India. She studies snake goddesses, which sounds fascinating. She has taken many students here to India with her, and I hope others will go as well. I'm also happy to see some students here today. If you ask a Hindu what is your religion, they will say Sanātana Dharma. Now, that's not Carlos Santana from the 60s band, okay? No, Sanātana Dharma, which means something like the eternal religion. And what they're saying is our religion has always been here. And I think at some level, pretty much every religion argues the same thing, right? They will trace it back to the very beginning for reasons of authority, right? And again, that is the way that they have constructed their own self-images, religiously, socially speaking. 330 million gods and goddesses. What you see as time goes on. In the myths coming from the sacred scriptures of the Hindus, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, what you see is an evolution of thinking about the divine, right? And you can imagine how difficult it might be to keep up with 330 million gods and goddesses. For instance, if every one of them had a holiday, well, we would never get anything done, right? But one of the things that I challenge you to do today, that I really encourage you to do, whatever your own religious, social, cultural background, try, if you can, to step into these other shoes, to look out that window, right, on the divine, and understand as much as we are capable of doing what it must be like to understand the divine in this way. Imagine, if you will, by some stroke of luck or God's will or karma, which is a little more relevant in this context, that you had been born in India, if indeed you yourself were not born in India. Imagine you grew up in this context, and what you had been taught from your mother's knee, right, is that there are many gods and goddesses, each of them different, each of them unique. And then for the first time you hear that there is a religion that has only one God. How does he keep up with everything? Right? Only one? Only one? Well, what happens in the history of Hindu thinking is that the religious philosophers begin to talk about the possibility, at least, and over time it becomes something of a certainty, that yes, there are 330 million different gods and goddesses, each in its own way unique, but they are all part of a much larger reality. And I don't want to use the term being, okay, because when I do, I'm afraid Gandalf is going to sneak back into your heads, right? That Western image of God as a being. Remember, we did the circles, right? In the West, we tend to think of the divine, right? Creating the world, and so that we're separate from the divine, and we have to get back to the divine, right? Once you toss in sin, then you have a real mess. You have a real challenge on your hand, right? It's all about how do we develop this relationship? How do we maintain it? Through prayer, a conversation between two separate beings, if you will, right? But in the East, generally speaking, right, the circles are not separate but concentric, that we are born into the midst of the divine. In fact, we ourselves are divine, and not just humans, right, but all creatures. The earth, the very cosmos itself, is holy, is sacred, is divine, is possessed of energy, of life. And the Hindus come to see that all of those many gods and goddesses are simply different faces of this one divine. And they give the divine a name, Brahman. Listen to how I say that. Brahman. Right? Brahman. And the term originally meant breath, as in to breathe, right? Breath, the divine breath, the breath of the universe. And it's actually a rather common notion in several of the religious traditions. For instance, if I may step into Judaism for just a moment, not to steal my own thunder or anything, it wouldn't be the first time, right? In the Jewish scriptures, when it is, and of course they become the Christian scriptures as well, when it is said that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, right? And the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, those primordial waters out of which all things come. Well, the actual term for spirit in Hebrew is ruach. And again, listen, ruach, right? It's the breath of God moved on the face of the waters. In the New Testament, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, pneuma, right? As in pneumatic tires, right? Again, you get this notion of the divine breath. So again, if the universe itself, if the cosmos, and oftentimes in the ancient world, the universe is pictured as a gigantic a gigantic male. Imagine that, right? Who's telling this story? It's not Eve, it's Adam, right? As a gigantic human being, of which we are all parts, right? Then the spirit is the breath, the soul of that cosmos, of that divine. And again, we can dismiss this as some ancient, perhaps even primitive myth. These poor, ignorant savages, how could they ever think of the universe that way? When we, with all our scientific knowledge, know that it's just a collection of atoms, right? And we're spinning at an incredible rate on a planet that is spinning at an incredible rate around a star that is spinning at an incredible rate around a black hole, right? Which itself is spinning at an incredible rate of speed, right, through this vast universe. Well, scientists are coming to understand that, in a way, the universe itself, in our construction of it, right, our understanding of it, is all of a piece. That the very same energy, if you will, right, that drives the stars, that keeps everything spinning, also pushes our hearts and keeps our lungs pumping, right? We are stardust. We are golden. To quote Joni Mitchell, one of my favorite musicians from back in the day. Brahman, right? Originally it means breath. It comes to mean the breath of the universe. And you could think of Brahman, and I don't mean to be unkind, but just to help illustrate somewhat, as having a split personality, only it's not the 3 faces of Eve, it's the 330 million faces of Brahman, right? The same divine, but showing itself in different ways. Now, some of you, I would imagine, are Christians, or you know enough about Christianity to know about the Trinity, right? God is one, but not. Those Christians. How'd they come up with that? One, but not. Does it not sound a little familiar to you, though? I mean, if you compare it with the Hindu understanding of 330 million in one, right? And each, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, they each play different roles, right? And yet they are somehow mystically one and the same. You could think of Brahman in that way. 330 million different personalities, if you will. And I use personalities advisedly because the root of that term, persona, comes from the Greek. Hello. That was a phone ringing for you elsewhere. Where was I? See, technology is of the devil, okay? It's of the devil. Oh, it's so tempting, right? So marvelous in its own way, so seductive, and yet, or maybe I'm just, scatterbrained. 330 million gods. I know we're talking about Hinduism, okay? Thank you. Good job. You're a good tribe. Persona, it means mask, right? So, like a tragedian, right, an actor in the Greek tragedies who might wear several faces, right, during one of those plays, Brahman does the same. If you need water, you need rain for your crops, you should talk to Indra, the storm god, right? And Brahman will come to you in this form. Now, if we have time today, I want to talk in particular about at least a couple of these manifestations, if you will, of the divine, of the cosmos, of Brahman. But first I wanted to say a word, and again I am generalizing. I'm not sure how else to do this. A word of comparison between